Hi, everybody. Um, Going to be talking to you today again about the Odyssey, which I just introduced in very general terms in the last lecture. Um, this is a text, as you know, and as I think we'll try to bring out over the next couple of weeks, a text that has as its major, ongoing, persistent thematic business stuff to do with the overarching theme or concept of our course, the concept of recognition. But today, in this lecture, I really just want to proceed at kind of a narrative level, just get into the text, so to speak, in its first at least four books from our reading. And so we're kind of continuing, I guess, this kind of rhythm that we have in this course, in which we oscillate between just trying to come to terms with these very strange, very ancient texts that we are reading on the one hand, and on the other, try to say some interesting and important things about them in accordance with our theme. Today, let's just try to orient ourselves in this lecture vis-a-vis the first four or five books of Homer's epic. We begin the Odyssey, of course, not with Odysseus at all, but rather with Odysseus's son Telemachus. We don't even see Odysseus in this text until book 5. The first four books are all about Telemachus. In fact, traditionally, as the editor of our course, of our text rather, mentions at one point, traditionally the first four books of the Odyssey are actually referred to as the Telemachy, which means the story of Telemachus. The idea is, the narrative situation, that is that at the beginning of the Odyssey, Odysseus has been away from his home on Ithaca for 20 years, 10 years at war in Troy, and then 10 years trying to make his way back. So Telemachus is around 20, having been a newborn baby when Odysseus went off to war. And the situation, of course, is that Odysseus has been away so long that a lot of pressure has come upon his widow Penelope to remarry. And in fact, her house or palace, which of course is also Odysseus's house or palace, is kind of occupied by a crew of greedy young men, basically, who are referred to generally as the suitors in the Odyssey. Men who are clamoring for Penelope, this attractive and rich, seemingly widow, to marry one of them. As we'll see, and as the editor, Emily Wilson, I think, comments on very effectively, one of the obsessions of the Odyssey is a certain conception, the ancient Greek conception of hospitality. A very, very powerful value in the world of the Odyssey, as it is in many ancient cultures and indeed modern cultures as well. But hospitality has a certain structure or shape or expectation in Homer's world that we'll talk about a fair bit more. The opening of the Odyssey with Telemachus, Penelope, the suitors occupying their house, eating their food, drinking their wine, day after day after day, year after year even. The opening of the Odyssey basically presents us with a situation in which hospitality is not only being used, but is being abused, if you like, as these guys, these suitors, refuse to go away, refuse to stop being guests, basically, until Penelope agrees to marry one of them. So if you think you've ever had a house guest that stayed too long, you have not had a house guest like these house guests. Telemachus, at the beginning of the Odyssey, is trying and struggling to respond to the long-term crisis that is unfolding in his house. He gets some help, as we'll see, from a goddess, the very great and powerful Greek goddess Athena. And in the end, in these first 4 books, what Telemachus does actually is kind of to run away from Ithaca. He gets a ship, and he sails off. He sails off from the island of Ithaca to 2 mainland Greek locations, first Pylos and then Sparta, with the goal of visiting and questioning 2 of his dad's old companions from the Trojan War. First of all, Nestor, who is the king of this town Pylos, and second of all, Menelaos, who is the king of Sparta. And as our editor comments, I think very effectively, we don't need to be too kind of Freudian to see this opening of the Odyssey, this Telemachy, as young Telemachus not only seeking his dad, which he is doing, but in the course of seeking his dad, kind of coming to spend some time with kind of 2 alternative father figures, both of whom are closely associated with Odysseus as his army buddies, as his former companions in fighting the Trojan War. Nestor is old and pious and long-winded. Menelaos is kind of aggressive and a bit bullying and sensuous. Menelaos is back together with his wife Helen, who was the casus belli, the cause or the reason for the Trojan War, according to the myth, having run off with the Trojan prince Paris. In the Odyssey, Menelaus and Helen are back together, kind of as if they've had to work out a bit of trouble in their marriage, but everything's fine now, and they seem actually quite happy together. Telemachus then leaves Ithaca, travels across the ocean, seeks out these alternative fathers, these boon companions of his father, in hopes of finding out if Odysseus is ever coming home. Has he been killed? Do you know if he has been killed? Do you know if he's ever going to make it back home to Ithaca? And so on. So that's a very brief narrative summary of what just happens in these first 4 books of the Odyssey. In some ways, not that much actually happens in these first 4 books of the Odyssey, and that may strike you, or may have struck you, as a little bit interesting, a little bit surprising, insofar as we are reading an epic, which is supposed to be about, the founding or the destruction of cities or civilizations. It's supposed to be about heroes and battles and violence and all that stuff. And that will come in to the Odyssey, but not yet. We start rather quietly and maybe rather strangely. This first section of the Odyssey, the story of Telemachus looking for some news of his dad. And having then entered that brief narrative summary of our reading for this lecture, having entered that into evidence, I just want to make a couple of general comments about it, and then we'll go on and look at some sections of the text in some detail together. But a couple of general observations to begin with. First, the Odyssey, as we have already discussed, as you guys know, the Odyssey is a sequel to the Iliad, which is Homer's story of, it's his story not of the whole Trojan War, it's his story of a climactic phase, although not final phase, but a climactic and dramatic phase in the 9-year Greek siege of Troy. The Odyssey tells what comes after, at least insofar as it is about one complicated man's attempt to make it home over the course of 10 years. I just want to emphasize or underline that the Odyssey, and I think this becomes very clear appropriately enough in these first 4 or 5 books of the epic, the Odyssey is very much conscious of itself as being a sequel. It very much presents itself as a sequel and reminds us that it is a sequel, or perhaps assumes that we know the story of the Iliad and its related stories, to which this is a sequel. These stories of the Trojan War, these are the kinds of stories that we can call myths in the ancient Greek context, very much like the Oedipus myth, with which we have been busy for the last couple of weeks. And again, when we say a story like that is a myth in this anthropological sense, as you guys know, we absolutely do not mean that word, that term, in a dismissive or deflationary way. Quite the contrary. A myth, in this sense, is a story that forms and informs a given culture or civilization. It's what shapes the way the members of a culture or civilization see themselves, see their people, see the world, and so on. These myths of the Trojan War are stories that, again, formed and informed Greek civilization of the classical and pre-classical period. They're what you know if you are a Greek person in this period. They're your cultural inheritance. And it is likely, as our editor, Dr. Wilson, tells us, it is likely that when we are looking at the myths of the Trojan War, we are looking at a kind of folk echoes of events that were at least in part true. So there had been, as some of you guys will know perhaps very well, there had been a much earlier form of highly developed civilization in Greece, going back to around 1500, 1200 BC, what we call the Mycenaean civilization. That civilization then had collapsed under various pressures, and Greece went through what is sometimes called a dark age, in which literacy was lost, for example. These myths of the Trojan War, they're probably to some extent folk echoes of that earlier phase of Greek civilization. These stories are rich and complex and multiple and interlocked. There's far more stories of and about and relating to the Trojan War, of course, than Homer is telling us in the Odyssey. But, and I guess this is the point that I'm trying to make at the moment, he kind of assumes that you know these stories. You, as an ancient Greek auditor or reader of the Odyssey. And in fact, we, from the very opening lines of the Odyssey, we find ourselves being confronted with one of these stories, one of these Trojan War stories, which are not central to the story of the Odyssey, but are antecedent to it, in other words, coming before it, and kind of peripheral to the story of the Odyssey. In other words, around the edges of the world or universe within which Homer is commencing this tale, the tale of Odysseus' homecoming. So I'm going to turn to the text now in Book 1, round about line 28 in our edition, where we've just been looking at the god Poseidon having a feast among the Ethiopians. A lot of feasting in Homer, as we have already discussed. We then kind of cut to Zeus in Mount Olympus. So we begin with the gods, really, in the Odyssey. So I'll pick this up from line 28. The other gods were gathered on Olympus in Father Zeus's palace. He, that is Zeus, he was thinking of fine, well-born Aegisthus, who was killed by Agamemnon's famous son Orestes. He told the deathless gods, "This is absurd, that mortals blame the gods. They say we caused their suffering, but they themselves increase it by folly." So Aegisthus overstepped. He took the legal wife of Agamemnon, then killed the husband when he came back home. Although he knew that it would doom them all, we gods had warned Aegisthus. We sent down perceptive Hermes, who flashed into sight and told him not to murder Agamemnon, Agamemnon or court his wife. Orestes would grow up and come back home to take revenge. Aegisthus would not hear that good advice, but now his death has paid all debts. We begin with Zeus referring to or talking about an entirely separate story from the kind of aftermath of the Trojan War. This is the myth of Agamemnon, who is the kind of lead king or chieftain of the Greek expedition against Troy. And in that particular area, let's say, in that portion of the Greek mythical universe, what happens is that Agamemnon himself comes home after the Trojan War. Unbeknownst to him, his wife, Clytemnestra, has taken up with a lover called Aegisthus. They kill Agamemnon, and then in the end, they are killed, or at least Aegisthus is killed by Agamemnon's son, Orestes, later on. So this is a very famous story in ancient Greek mythology. It's a kind of nightmare story from the perspective of this text. I mean, it's kind of like Clytemnestra is the anti-Penelope, Agamemnon is the anti-Odysseus, and Orestes, I suppose, is kind of the anti-Telemachus. But the point is, Homer is not telling that story. He's not setting out to tell that story. We're not going to get an epic from Homer about Agamemnon and Clytemnestra. Rather, Homer kind of assumes that you know this story. And he will enter briefly here and there in the Odyssey. He will enter into the text little reviews almost, or little summaries or précis of this or that other story from the Greek mythological universe centered on the Trojan War. So we will get a version of the story of the Trojan horse, for example, in the Odyssey. We learn about some wanderings of other kings and heroes, including Menelaus, following the conclusion of the war. And we even learn a bit, or we are reminded, I should say, a bit, about how the Trojan War is supposed to have started, according to the Greek mythological account, in this affair between beautiful Helen and the Trojan prince Paris. As we have already discussed, when we're looking at the Odyssey, we are looking at an incredible text which originally seems to have been composed and handed down orally before being written down around 700 BC. And as I've been trying to explain or make clear already in this lecture, we're also looking, in stories like this, we're probably looking at folk cultural echoes of an earlier phase in Greek civilization. For us, as 21st century readers, the point I want to make, actually, the point into which I want to kind of gather all that stuff is actually quite a bit simpler and maybe even a bit less serious, let's say. The simple point is, again, when we are reading the Odyssey, we really are reading a sequel, which is as though based on a previous text that did really, really well. You know, when you see this kind of cast of characters, Menelaus, Nestor, Agamemnon, and others, when you see them re-emerging into the trailer, so to speak, for the Odyssey, it really is as though, it can feel as though, and there's nothing wrong with this feeling, there's everything right with this feeling. It can feel as though you are watching a product, this text, which is here because the previous product, the Iliad, did really, really well. Much as though the writers of a movie get back together and they say, wow, we made a lot of money on that joint, let's make some more. Very much a sequel, the Odyssey. And this effect, I think, is actually heightened in kind of a nice way by the translation that we have from Emily Wilson, which is extremely accessible, I think. Nowadays, of course, we talk about all kinds of narrative universes. We have the Star Wars universe, the Star Trek universe, the Harry Potter universe, and my kids' favorite, of course, is the Marvel Comics universe, or what they call the MCU. I'm really just trying to point out that when we are opening the Odyssey and situating ourselves within it, we are in the Homerverse, okay? And that is a universe of multiple interlocking stories, some of which have been told elsewhere, some of which will be told here, others of which will merely be remembered, recalled, invoked, entered for review. A very complex narrative world of multiple interlocking stories from the Greek mythological tradition. Which I think leads into another general summary opening observation, which has to do with the narrative structure of the Odyssey, what kind of story it is, how this story is organized. If you have a narrative universe of multiple interlocking stories, such as Homer does have, where do you start? Where do you enter into this shifting ocean of elements from the Greek mythological tradition? Well, you just have to start somewhere. You have to dive in. As we have already said, the Odyssey starts not with Odysseus, but with Telemachus, and Helen helping out, Athena helping out Telemachus as he hopes to find out something about his dad. Much, much later, we finally see Odysseus for the first time. We finally see him in Book 5 on the island of the demigoddess Calypso, where he has been stranded for 7 years. That's a very large part of the 10 years it takes him to get back home. And only much, much, much later will Odysseus, in Book 9, take us back to the beginning in a kind of tale within a tale effect and explain what happened to him after the Trojan War ended and how he came to be stranded on Calypso's island. The very first 11 lines of the Odyssey, Book 1, I now want to read because they're on this point. At the beginning of the Odyssey, of course, Homer invokes, which means calls upon, a muse, the muse being conceived of here as, again, a demigoddess of the Greek pantheon in charge of inspiration and literature, stories. Homer asks the muse, implores the muse, he says, "Tell me about a complicated man, muse. Tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went, and who he met, the pain he suffered on the sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. He failed, and for their own mistakes they died. They ate the sun god's cattle, and the god kept them from home. Now, goddess, child of Zeus, tell the old story for our modern times. Find the beginning." That request or demand or imperative from Homer to the muse, find the beginning, I think is really interesting and memorable, because what it reminds us is, of course, that the beginning is not that easy to find, especially in a story like this one that is explicitly a sequel. You have to go back to before the beginning in order to set up the beginning, or maybe there's many different possible beginnings in a story like this one. In the Odyssey, of course, we don't actually begin at the beginning of Odysseus' story at all. We don't even begin at the beginning of Odysseus' post-Trojan War story. We begin in the middle of the story, sort of, and then we'll find our way to another middle of the story later on, and only then will we flash back to something that can be called the beginning of the story. And this aspect of Homer's narrative, not beginning at the beginning, but finding your way to the beginning at the middle, more or less. This aspect of Homer's narrative, according to tradition or in the wake of Homer, becomes a kind of part of the epic poetry rule book. And it's formalized under actually a Latin phrase, which is in medias res, and I'll of course put that on the Canvas page. That means going into the middle of things or into middle stuff. So the epic narrative begins in the middle, and then we find our way back to the beginning much later on. Meanwhile, of course, and in a way that I think is maybe more interesting and a bit more profound, the whole story is the story of Odysseus, in a sense, trying to find his way back to the beginning, back to the way things used to be and presumably should be. That's the nature of Odysseus's homecoming. So we have a meditation, let's say, on beginnings, an inquiry into beginnings, and maybe the possibility of doing some thinking about just what a strange and slippery and tantalizing thing a beginning as such is. Now, the beginning of the Odyssey, such as it is, once it emerges, has to do, as we have said, with Telemachus and Athena, the great Greek goddess of wisdom and of war. And I added a handout on Athena to the Canvas page, which I hope you guys will find useful and interesting. Athena loves Odysseus and therefore loves his family for reasons that are not entirely clear. It's not even totally consistent that she loves Odysseus. She participates in making his life difficult sometimes, but in general, she's very much on Odysseus's side. And she enters the text at book 1. We can pick it up from line 113. She enters the text swooping down from Mount Olympus in order to help out Telemachus, who is in this fix at home with Penelope and the suitors. And of course, and as is totally typical of the way the gods make their appearances, in Homer, Athena goes down to help Telemachus, but she goes down in disguise. She takes the form of a man called Mentes, who is the leader of a place called Taphos. So I'm going to pick this up from line 113. Athena, in the guise of Mentes, appears outside Telemachus's house. And Homer writes of Telemachus, he says, in his mind, he saw his father coming from somewhere, scattering the suitors and gaining back his honor and control of all his property. With this in mind, he was the first to see Athena there, that is, Athena in the guise of Mentes. And Telemachus doesn't realize that's Athena. He just sees this old guy, Mentes. With this in mind, he was the first to see Athena there. He disapproved of leaving strangers stranded, so he went straight to meet her at the gate and shook her hand and took her spear of bronze and let his words fly out to her. Good evening, stranger, and welcome. Be our guest. Come share our dinner, and then tell us what you need. He led her in, and Pallas followed him. Inside the high-roofed hall, he set her spear beside a pillar in a polished stand in which Odysseus kept stores of weapons. And then he led her to a chair and spread a smooth embroidered cloth across the seat and pulled a footstool up to it. He sat beside her on a chair of inlaid wood, a distance from the suitors, so their shouting would not upset the stranger during dinner. Also, to to ask about his absent father. A girl brought washing water in a jug of gold, and poured it on their hands and into a silver bowl, and set a table by them. A deferential slave brought bread, and laid a wide array of food, a generous spread. The carver set beside them plates of meat of every kind, and gave them golden cups. The cup boy kept on topping up the wine. And I'm going to pause there. And I want to note, first of all, about that passage, just how utterly characteristic that is of the Odyssey and of the values, for lack of a better word, that inform the Odyssey. It is astonishing how many times in this long poem we watch the heroes and other characters sitting down to eat, and eat meat in particular, something that we want to come back to. You may ask, in reading a passage like that, what's happening there? Why do we get such a long description of sitting down to eat? Well, because in Homer nothing is more important than that. And so we get that kind of scene over and over again. And another point to make about that scene and that kind of scene in the Odyssey, it comes back to this really kind of astonishing and powerful theme in the Odyssey, the theme of hospitality, which we've already talked about a fair bit. What Telemachus does in that scene is to enact the appropriate ancient Greek attitude to hospitality. He sees this old guy standing outside his house. The old guy is apparently a person who is somewhat important, which you can tell because he has a bronze spear. In the Homerverse, you do not leave a stranger standing outside your house. You go get them, you invite them into dinner without having any idea who they are. Telemachus does not know who this figure is at that moment. But first and foremost, you bring them in, you give them dinner, and then you say, who the heck are you? Anyway, what's your story? What are you doing here? We get this scene of welcoming, pouring wine, eating meat over and over and over again in this poem. And again, this is a major Homeric value, the value of hospitality, but we can also push it a bit farther, I think, and render this aspect of Homer's narrative, Homer's thinking even, we could say, a little bit more problematic, a little bit deeper, a little bit more tantalizing. And we can do that as follows, again, with some help from our editor and translator, Emily Wilson. She points out in her introduction, because she knows Greek, obviously, the word that we have in Greek, in the ancient Greek, for hospitality is the word xenia, Xenia, xenia. A very, very, I think, interesting word. It's actually the word root for our word in English, xenophobia, which means fear of strangers, fear or hatred of strangers, right? So when people look with suspicion on immigrants or whatever, we say they're being xenophobic, fearful of or hateful toward the stranger, the other, the person who comes from another culture. So there's something very cool going on there etymologically, with potentially some philosophical significance. Xenia means hospitality, but it generates our word xenophobic. And we could do something very similar with a couple of other words we have in English, although these come from Latin roots. The word host, so Telemachus is being a good host in the scene that we just looked at. But the word host is cognate with, which means it comes from the same root as, the word hostile. When you're being a host, a good host, you are precisely not being hostile, right? And to show hostility would be precisely not the same thing as to show hospitality. To be xenophobic would be precisely not the same thing as to show xenia, the ancient Greek term. And yet, the etymology of these terms suggests to us something I think potentially very profound and very troubling, which is if we go down deep enough into these phenomena, we may find that they are identical rather than opposites. In some way, the host and the hostile are maybe sides of the same coin, something like that. And to step down from that level for a moment, we can just try to make some sense of that set of points by saying, when the Odyssey is representing to us the ancient Greek value of xenia or hospitality, in part and at one level, what Homer is doing is kind of ringing that bell or scratching that itch of the ancient Greek value. He's showing a scene in which you kind of go, oh, that's how you do it. That's how to greet somebody you don't really know. That's how to have a feast with lots of roast meat and wine and bread. At one level, that's all Homer's doing. But at another level, which I think is more interesting and challenging and important, Homer, I think, is actually potentially leading us into an inquiry into the nature of hospitality. How does one approach the stranger? What is it to have that relationship between the self and the other? How does the stranger approach? How should the stranger approach? So what's the relationship between the here and the there, the strange and the familiar, the self and the other? That, I think, at a kind of moral philosophical level, is where Homer's representation of xenia or hospitality ultimately goes. And I think we also would be able to tie that issue back to the whole question of Odysseus's homecoming, his attempt to get back to himself, to his life, to his identity, to the way things used to be and presumably ought to be, and why that is so difficult, and whether it can even be performed, that epic homecoming. Okay, last thing that I think I want to deal with, or maybe a last couple of things in this lecture. First of all, the relationship in the Odyssey between human beings and gods. I talked in the last lecture, and you guys will already be aware in general, I think, about the ancient Greek conception of divinity. The world is full of gods, and the gods have power and control over various aspects of human society and also of the natural world. And the gods are conceived of as exceedingly powerful supernatural beings, however, not all powerful beings. Their power is limited in the first instance by each other, and in the second instance perhaps by the very nature of the world as it is represented and understood in what I am calling the Homerverse. The gods repeatedly and, as it were, casually intervene in and participate in human lives and human actions. Typically, if not invariably, though, they do so in disguise. So the model is not one in which you suddenly come around the corner and meet a god and go, ah! It's rather a model in which you meet an old man, a boy, a young girl, whatever, and only at the end of the encounter, as I was saying last time, do you realize that you have just been talking to a god. Telemachus, having invited Mentes, this old man, into his home, having sat him down, fed him meat and wine, they have a long conversation which goes on for several hundred lines, in which Athena, in the guise of Mentes, gives Telemachus this idea she's like, well, Telemachus, you're really sitting here not achieving very much. Why don't you get on a ship, sail to Pylos, and then go to Sparta, see Nestor and Menelaus, try to find out what's happened to your dad, okay? That's what she, in the guise of Mentes, encourages him to do. Telemachus is very much taken with this advice, and he does what you do to a guest in the ancient Greek world, which is that he tries to make the guest stay. And this, again, I think is very interesting and kind of tantalizing. Guests can overstay their welcome, as have the suitors in Telemachus's house. At the same time, hosts can, let's say, overextend their welcome. A guest that you won't allow to leave, that's not a guest anymore, that's a prisoner, right? Which is actually Odysseus' situation on the island of the nymph Calypso. He's no longer a guest, he's being held hostage there. So again, we have this this double-sided phenomenon of hospitality, which seems to appear under both negative and positive moral aspects, let's say. So I'm going to look now at around line 310 in Book 1. Telemachus is imploring Mentes to stay, to have a bath, to take a gift. Homer writes, but the goddess Athena met his gaze and said, do not hold me back now. I must be on my way. As for the gift you feel inspired to give me, save it for when I come on my way home, and let me give you presents then as well in fair exchange. With that, the owl-eyed goddess flew away like a bird up through the smoke. She left him feeling braver, more determined, and with his father even more in mind. Watching her go, he was amazed and saw she was a god. Then, godlike, he went off to meet the suitors. And we get an almost identical scene later in Book 3 when Athena, in a slightly different guise, the guise of a man called Mentor. Why Homer feels like we have to have a Mentes and a mentor, I don't know, but that's just how it is. We get an almost identical scene in Book 3 when, again, Telemachus has been in the company, he thinks, of an old guy called Mentor, who knows his dad. For a long, long time, this guy has organized his ship to go to Pylos. He sailed along with him. He goes into the palace of Nestor, and then poof, he flies away in the guise of a bird, and they realize, oh, that was a god all along. You might well ask some of the characters in Homer, do you think you might be a bit more suspicious when you meet an old man who knows all about your dad? Maybe you should go, are you a god? That never happens, I'm afraid, in Homer. It's always the same moment of surprise and recognition at the end of the divine encounter, when they realize they have been talking to one of the immortals. So, we have a world in which there are these two different levels of being. The human, earthly, mortal level, and the divine, Olympian level of the gods. And of course, there's levels within that heavenly level, too. The border between the human and the divine, the earthly and the Olympian, the border between those two levels of being is incredibly important in the Homeric world. There could be nothing more important than that barrier. At the same time, it is a barrier that is regularly, and as I said, almost casually breached or traversed by the gods themselves. They're always swooping down to intervene in human affairs. And in a few stories of the Homerverse, it works the other way. People can actually kind of graduate under very special circumstances into the supernatural level. Odysseus himself, as we'll see, is being invited by the demigoddess Calypso to become immortal. That's the deal she's offering him. He chooses to go back to Penelope and therefore chooses the earth and chooses mortality. Nonetheless, we get this incessant exchange between humans and immortals in the Homerverse. And the other point I want to make about that is this. Athena, and it's a very nice example, Athena wants to help Odysseus and Telemachus. And she does help them, helps Telemachus go do something, basically, to get some news about his dad. But Athena doesn't do that just by kind of snapping her fingers. She doesn't transport Telemachus to Pylos or Pylos. For that matter, she doesn't make it so Odysseus just comes home. She has to work through what we can call secondary causes. So she goes in disguise. She hatches this plan. She kind of lights a fire, so to speak, under Telemachus. She finds him a ship. She sails with him. She has to work through earthly means to help her earthly proteges. And there is, I think, something very important about the Homeric world at stake there, which we will come back to a number of times, I think, over the next couple of weeks, having to do with the nature and the power of the gods as they are understood by the ancient Greeks. The gods are extremely powerful, as I've already said today, but they are not all powerful. Their power is, let's say, limited. It's unchangeably limited in certain ways. And one of the things that we will want to watch very carefully as we make our way through the Odyssey is not so much what the gods can do, they can do a lot of stuff, but rather what can't the gods do in the Odyssey. And I think we will come up with some, let's say, worthwhile answers to that question. Okay, last little bit before I wrap up this rather long lecture. Last little bit is going to go back to a point I was making earlier, which has to do with the nature of the Odyssey as a sequel, but I want to return to that point via the figure of Telemachus. When we're reading the Odyssey, as you guys know, we are reading a story of heroes in the ancient Greek sense, which doesn't mean, as I said in the last lecture, it doesn't mean good guys or people who are moral paragons at all. It just means men who are very, very powerful. And by that, Homer really means, physically powerful, militarily violent and ruthless. That is the heroic ethos that we have, for the most part, in Homer. Beginning the Odyssey with Telemachus is kind of odd in that respect, because, of course, Telemachus is not very heroic at all, as I hope you guys will have noticed. I mean, not to be mean to him, but, he's kind of whiny. He's a little wimpy. He is sort of unhappily, grumpily sitting in the midst of this chaotic abuse of the core ancient Greek value of xenia, or hospitality. All these aggressive young guys who are fantasizing about his mom, demanding that she marry one of them, meanwhile eating them both out of house and home, slaughtering their livestock, drinking their wine, and so on and so forth. And Telemachus, it seems, is unable to do a darn thing about it. He is supposed to be about age 20, because Odysseus has been away for 20 years, and we are told several times that Telemachus was a new baby when Odysseus went away. How old was Odysseus when he went away? Well, people got married young in the Greek world. They had kids young. Penelope and Odysseus only have this one child, Telemachus, so presumably he's their first, or at least their first surviving baby. Odysseus may well have been himself not much more than 25 when he went away to fight in the Trojan War. In this poem, in this story, he's represented to us, I guess, as a kind of hale and hearty man of 45, maybe 50. Point being, Telemachus is not that much younger than Odysseus, heroic, powerful, epic Odysseus was when he went off to fight in the Trojan War. The Odyssey is a story of heroes in that ancient Greek sense, but it's also, and maybe more importantly, a story of what happens after heroes have stopped being heroic. It's a late career story, let's say, and it's as though when we're looking at a figure like Telemachus, this young man who's obsessed with his dad and seemingly does not measure up and feels he doesn't measure up to the standard set by his dad. It's like we're looking at a post-heroic age when we are at the beginning of the Odyssey. So I was saying earlier in the lecture that these stories, these Greek myths about the Trojan War, they're probably archaic folk Greek echoes of an earlier phase of their own civilization. So the stories are looking back to an earlier phase of Greek civilization as heroic, as providing these kinds of standards of behavior when men were men and all that kind of stuff. The point I'm simply trying to make and trying to emphasize to round out this lecture is that we actually begin the poem itself with that kind of effect, with that kind of feeling, with that kind of figure. Telemachus as a post-heroic young man, left abandoned by his father, abandoned by the heroic age in general, and not knowing how to respond other than to reach out haplessly and belatedly to try to reestablish contact with that heroic age through the figures of his father's war buddies, Nestor and Menelaus. Okay, that will do, I think, for this lecture, you guys. So thank you very much, as always, for your attention. We'll pick it up next time with, first of all, Odysseus on the island of Calypso, and then going farther to the central portion of the poem, where Odysseus actually, in his own words, will take us back to the beginning and explain how he got to where he is when we find him. Okay, for now, I'll just say thank you very much for watching.